Hello, my name is Lynn Smarsh. I am the oldest of 7. My mother was the oldest of 7. Her mother was the oldest of 7. Her mother, that is my great-grandmother, is the person I'm speaking about. Her name was Margaret Ethel Bowl. She was born Margaret Ethel Elliott in Pembroke, Ontario in 1892. That's right, 1892. Here's a picture of her on her wedding day. So let me tell you about my grandmother, my great-grandmother. In Pembroke, Ontario, there was a young man that she was in love with. When she turned 18, they married. His name was Bob Bowl. She was English Protestant. He was Roman Catholic. Irish. Well, that didn't sit so well with the family. But they gave in and they were able to marry. And soon they had children, and Bob decided to move with his brothers to the west. He got a job on the railroad, and so he was able to get a quarter section of land, and this would be in the new province of Saskatchewan. And so they packed up their belongings, packed up the 2 children, and off they went to Saskatchewan. And they got off the train at a place called Elfross. Now that was an Icelandic community. They had to bring their house with them, but they couldn't afford to do that. They were newlyweds, really. And so they had to make a house of sod. They took their shovels, they went to their quarter section, and in order to keep a quarter section, you had to clear the land. So they dug the sod and built a house. That sod house was warm in the winter because the walls were very thick. Cool in the summer. But my great-grandmother said when it rained, which it did in the spring, you had to take everything out of the house and you had to vacate the house. Because as the rain gently dripped through, everything would be soiled with dirt. So that's the way it was. They lived in a sod house for 2 years until they had enough money to build a house, and they built that in Elfross. They eventually sold their quarter section because they had cleared the land, they had built a shelter, and they received that money. By the time their 7th child came, they had decided to move to Wynyard, Saskatchewan. That's the next town down the line. And Bob continued to work with the railroad. And in the meantime, Ethel was learning things, because although education was limited for women in those days, didn't mean that you couldn't read. And she did. And she took home nursing courses because she had a large family to take care of. And there were no doctors in the community at that time. In 1922, my great-grandfather, who had diabetes, damaged his leg in a train accident and developed gangrene. So he was taken immediately to the hospital in Saskatoon, about 50 miles away, and that's where he died. Ethel was left with 7 children, and she was not 30. And so, yeah, it was a tough time. So in 1923, she moved the family from Wynyard to Saskatoon so that the children could be educated and she could find work in order to be able to support her family. And she did. She was a home nurse and worked in Saskatoon as a home nurse for many years. She also worked with the St. John's Ambulance Society and won Canadian awards for this work. And she ran a market stall every Saturday in Saskatoon. Eventually, just after the war, when 3 of her children were located in the Edmonton area, she moved herself to Edmonton. And that's where she is in this picture. In the picture, you see that she's working on something with her hands. That's how I remember my great-grandmother. She was always busy with her hands. She knit, she crocheted, she was sewing things. She had a small sewing machine, a Singer, that she would run, very efficient and so on. But what did she sell in her market stall? These were the things that she sold. Things for the house, things for children, things for dolls, every type of thing that she could imagine. In the winter there would be mittens. In the summer there would be all sorts of things for the house, like aprons and places to wash your hands and, all sorts of things. She used to live with us before she went into a nursing home in Edmonton. And she was quite amazing. Her mind was very sharp, even though she was becoming very frail at that time. She was over 80 then. I remember one day I was in university. This would be 1971. I was in university and my boyfriend was a medical student. And he came to pick me up one Saturday afternoon, and my sister Joan came screaming into the house. She stepped on a nail, a rusty nail, in the yard, in the schoolyard. So she ran home, and by this time it was killing her. Took the nail out, okay, and looked at the wound, tried to clean it up as much as possible. My medical student boyfriend said, "Oh, she has to go to the hospital immediately. We must take her right now." And my great-grandmother, who was sitting there, said, "Just a minute. Let's take some of that poison out before we take her to the hospital. It won't hurt. It'll make her more comfortable." So, what did she do? She got together a clean tea towel, white tea towel, and she put into this brown sugar, dry mustard, salt, and cloves. And I thought to myself, that's unusual. What is she doing? She's making a poultice. She folded this up, tied it together, and put it on my sister's foot, elevated my sister's foot up so that she could get to it, and said, "Now we'll wait for half an hour and check it, and then an hour, and we'll see what's happened." Well, we were all saying, "Gee, this is really serious. We have to take my sister to the hospital. And Jean, can you take her in your car?" "No, I can't. No, it's not enough room." So Mom had to get the station wagon. Oh, okay, that's happening. Meanwhile, my great-grandmother is sitting with my sister Joan, talking to her and telling her stories and keeping her nice and calm. An hour goes by. She said, all right, let's check everything. Well, we took this off her foot. The tea towel was absolutely disgusting. It was orange and yellow and all sorts of gunk. And her foot looked beautiful. Then we bandaged it up, took her to the hospital. She sat there for a couple of hours until they saw her in emergency, and they were amazed when my mom told them the story. And they said, what did you put in the poultice? So my mother described it. She said, yeah, that's the way to do it. The medical student, my boyfriend, never forgot it, remembered it, wrote it down, described it to his fellows at school. They were all amazed, and they asked me questions about my great-grandmother. I was never more proud of that woman in my life. But she passed away about a year later. So in 1973, she's buried with her husband in Wynyard. I'm going to talk about my grandmother. Her name was Mary Pauline Barry, but she was born Mary Pauline Keats. Yes, Keats, Keats, like the poet. In fact, she was related to that poet through the poet's brother, who is related to a poet that you know. Well, I'm lucky enough. And my grandmother and her sisters always talked about John Keats, like they knew him. Those were the stories that were handed down through her family from Newfoundland. So she was not born in Newfoundland. She was born in North Sydney Mines, where her father was a timekeeper for the mines. He worked in the office of the mines because he could read and write, and many of the miners at that time could not. They lived in North Sydney, which is near Bridore Lakes. So my grandmother used to tell stories about going skating on Bridore Lake in the wintertime, and how her mother would make brown bread in a can and beans, and she would serve these when they came back from skating. Who else lived at Bridore during the summer was Alexander Graham Bell. In 1909, Douglas McCurdy made a first flight over Bridore Lake in a plane. That was the first flight of the British Empire. My grandmother was there. She heard it. It was in the summertime, and it was at Bridore Lake. She said she'd never heard such a noise in her life. It was incredible, and it never stopped. So they got out of the lake, they ran up to the house and wondered what was happening. And then they saw this huge bird in the sky and realized, oh, that's not a bird. Alexander's doing his stuff again. He had the big house across the lake. It was lovely. Pauline was one of many girls in her family. The Keatses had two boys, one of which became a priest. The other one was a hockey player. And The rest were girls. There were 7 girls. What could girls do during that time? This was the turn of the century. So my grandmother was born in 1899. And this was a formative time. You could be a nun if you were Catholic. You could be a nurse, maybe, if you were adventurous. You could be a teacher, or you could be a housewife. That's what was open. And my grandmother, Pauline, and her sister, Teresa, and her sister, Mary, decided that they would go to be teachers because they loved reading and they loved writing. And they had that connection to the poet. So they thought, what else could they do? Well, that was fine. They went off to Antigonish to Teachers College in Nova Scotia. In 1917, during the First World War, they went back home. They were there during the Halifax explosion. So they did not receive the damage that Antigonish did. They were home. They heard the boom. They could feel the house shake. But they were not involved in the damage that was happening in Halifax and beyond. And it happened the wave went all the way up to Antigonish, which is near the New Brunswick border. My grandmother and her sister graduated from Teachers College and set about trying to find a job. Well, at that time, Spanish flu was beginning to make its presence felt. The war had made teaching positions open for young women everywhere, especially across the prairies, where 60% of the men had gone to war, especially the young men who would have been the teachers. My grandmother and her sister Teresa they had a teaching position secured, a new place called Alberta. Where was this? But they looked on a map. My great-grandparents gave my grandmother a big black teacher's umbrella for graduating from Teachers College. And Teresa received one too. And this went into the trunk that they took with them on the train to go from New Brunswick, where they had to get on the train, to Alberta a week later, because that's how long the journey was. When they got to the place, there was no city, there was no station. There was a flag with a name, and that's where they got off. Well, okay, they got off the train, they got their trunk, everything was bright and sunny. What were they going to do? They were told just to wait, somebody would be along. But there were no roads. Well, along came this huge car, about 20 minutes later, a huge car, open, and it had a couple of places in it for people to sit. The superintendent of the school district came to pick them up. My Aunt Teresa was going to be in one place in his district, and my grandmother Pauline was going to be in another. So he picked them up, and he took them to their new schools and to the place where they would be boarding. If there was no station and there was no town, where were they going to live? And where was the school? School was out on the prairie. Again, no trees. They were in southern Alberta. No trees, rolling hills. It was an amazing place. So my Aunt Pauline or my Aunt Teresa went to one place. About 5 miles more was my grandmother Pauline. And he had places for them to stay. They boarded with the members of their school. They went from one house. 3 months later, they would be at another house. 3 months later, another family would take them in. And that's how they spent the year. And times were very different for schools at that time. Number one, there was Spanish influenza coming back from the war, and people were quick to die. So very often you would see people around in masks. And just like now, with COVID, if you're sick, you stay home. That was the idea. If you were sick, if you had a fever, don't come to school, don't spread it around, stay home, get well, come back to school. We'll catch up later. What were they going to do for the teachers to keep them healthy? The first place my grandmother boarded was a Polish family. And every morning or every afternoon into the evening, before she sat down for supper with the family, my grandmother was given a bowl of sautéed onions. The lady of the house would make her a special bowl of sautéed onions to keep her healthy. To the end of her days, she never got sick with flu. She never got sick with anything, but she'd never eaten onions before in her life. So, interesting. School was very different in those days. You had up to 40 students in a class, and those classes would be divided into various grades. She was prepared to teach everything from kindergarten to grade 8. After grade 8, children went to a high school, which meant that they had to leave where they were living and go to a town, because the towns had the high schools. But the farming areas had grades 1 to 8. So she taught everything in those days. And timing was very different in those days. My grandmother told me that during planting season, the children were all needed at home, so school would stop for the planting season. School would also stop for the harvest. If it got really, really cold, they would not go to school. They couldn't go to school because it would be too dangerous for them to leave and walk 3 miles in a blizzard to go to school. Not possible. So during the summer, they didn't have summer vacation. They would catch up on all of their things from school. They might have 1 or 2 weeks off, and that was good. Times change. And eventually, my grandmother married. Now, a married woman in those days was expected to be at home. So your job, your employment finished when you got married. And my grandmother's employment finished as a teacher when she got married. Her love of learning, her love of writing and poetry never diminished. It came in handy come the Second World War, when the family, her husband, Eugene Barry, had moved to Edmonton with the family, and he had brothers. They lived in the border area between Saskatchewan and Alberta. And during the 30s, during the Dust Bowl area, they were blown out of Saskatchewan and they came into Alberta. Two decided that they would become landowners. So the three of them, Jimmy, Dan Patrick, and Jean Barry, all decided to get farms. And Jimmy was lucky enough to be near Lac St. Anne, and so was Dan Patrick near Lac St. Anne. They both had quarter sections. They were lucky to get a quarter section. Jean had, he took over a farm from one of the French families near Legal. He loved to be on the farm, but he really wasn't a farmer. He had huge hens. He was a telegrapher by trade. That's what he had learned to do during the war, during the First World War. So what he would do was he hired a man, and this was a German man. His name was Henry Olf. He was a newcomer, but he wanted to be a farmer. And so Henry came and lived and was their hired hand. Pauline taught him English. In trade for this, Henry helped them with the farm. And Eugene was able to go and do telegraphy work during the week, come home on the weekend. That was wonderful because he was a talented telegrapher. He worked for Associated Press and Reuters, both. And that's how people got the news in those days. But Pauline and Henry ran the farm. That was great until the 30s depression hit. Suddenly everything was topsy-turvy and so on. They sold the farm in Legal, moved to Edmonton. Henry stayed with them, but worked with Dan Patrick and Jimmy on the farms near Lac St. Anne. Henry eventually became a contractor in the city and stayed close to the family all of his life. Jimmy was an amazing guy, never married. He was one of those homesteaders that you read about. Cut his own logs, made his own home, made his own everything. In 1933, at the height of the Depression, he cut the logs one winter for a cabin. This cabin is still standing from 1933 to now, close to 100 years. This cabin is found at Alberta Beach, number 1 Alberta Beach, on the beach road near Central Avenue. And it was the summer home for all of the Berries. Dan Patrick, Jimmy, and my grandmother's family. In the Second World War, my grandmother said, "All right, what are we going to do?" My father was in grade 9. He left school in grade 10 to join the armed forces with his parents' permission. My grandfather was mustered back into the armed forces as a telegrapher teacher because he knew communications. Those were needed here. So, and my grandmother Pauline said, we have to make room, we have to add, for the family, and I will become the breadwinner. You people do what you need to. I'll take care of the family and I will become a teacher again. Because so many male teachers and students left for the Second World War, and they left Edmonton. They were gone for 6 years. My grandmother went back to teaching. They made a stipulation in Edmonton Catholic. If you were an experienced teacher and you were married, please come and join us. And she did. She taught until 1951 with Edmonton Catholic, and she taught at St. Alphonsus School. Things were very different then from her first experiences as a teacher of 40 students in a classroom. Now she would have 40 students in her grade 4 classroom, but they were from all over the world. They were from anywhere you could think about, coming into Edmonton to live. And because St. Alphonsus was a central school and they could afford to live there, that's why they came. My grandmother was quite amazing, but she did tell me the truth about John Keats when I was in university and really asked the questions. My grandmother lived until 1997. She was born in 1899. She lived until she was 98 years old. She was very proud of having done that, very proud of the institutions that she had seen, the changes that she had seen in her time, and she talked about them. Thank goodness she talked about them. And I happened to be listening. I am one of the granddaughters of Peter Daniel McNeil. He came from this farm in Prince Edward Island near Malpeque Bay. In 1746, the Acadians were driven out of Prince Edward Island from their ancestral home because they would not sign allegiance to the King of England. Those farms and homes were then given to Loyalist Scots and Irishmen. And that's what happened with this farm. My grandfather's family came from Scotland, from the Isle of Barra in 1800. In 1810, they were given that farm in Prince Edward Island. They kept all sorts of animals. It was a mixed farm. And so they had, of course, they had dairy, and they had some sheep, not many. They had, they planted linen, and they planted potatoes, and they kept some pigs for the scraps and so on. My grandfather came from a large family. There were 8 children in his family. And as a young man, he went to school for 3 years. So he went to school up to grade 3. And then he was apprenticed out to a fur farmer. And that's what he's holding here. He's holding a fox, a silver fox, a prized animal. My grandfather became an excellent fur farmer, and there were opportunities west. So he came west, married a woman that he saw and fell in love with immediately. And in South Edmonton, they had a fur farm, and he ran fur farms for several people. Most notably in North Edmonton at Belmont, there was a huge fur farm. They kept horses, but not for riding, not for ranching. They kept them for the horse meat. They butchered the horses to feed to the furs, to feed the mink and the fox, and so on. He was an amazing person, taught me how to read a fur. So when I go into a shop and I look at a fur, you'll see me moving my hand across the fur like this. I'm separating the guard fur to take a look at what's down below in the underfur, because that's the way you tell the quality of a pelt. My grandfather taught me that. In many years, he was able to win awards for his ability to produce absolutely gorgeous furs. Now you'd think, why would anybody need all of those furs? We're talking about times when you didn't have Gore-Tex, you didn't have lovely puff jackets that don't have any weight to them at all. No, you didn't have down, eider down, because that was another place, another time. But you did have fur. A friend of mine from New York once told me a fur coat is a luxury in New York. In Edmonton, it's a necessity. There were all sorts of furriers in Edmonton. And my grandfather sold the best to the best. One year, they decided to hang up all of the pelts before they were sold. These are all silver fox pelts from my grandfather's farm, Canadian Championship. My grandfather had lots of demons. The drink was his big demon. It cost him. But he was able to farm. He stayed married the rest of his life to a wonderful woman, my grandmother. Fathered 7 children, all doing totally different things in their lives. And he was able to live a good and healthy life. Thank you very much.